And most of all, I try and tell how these two histories intersect, the history of the idea of race and the struggles to overcome it. But I think it's in the intersection that we begin to understand how we've got to where we've got to. So that, in a sense, is, you know, is the reason I wrote the book.
No, and I think it certainly does feel really incredibly pertinent, certainly from a UK perspective. And I've just noticed there's a couple of people from North America, Canada, and the US in the audience as well. And I'm interested just to hear any reflections from the audience, just to pop them in the chat, actually, just in terms of if you've read the book, in particular, you know, how has it impacted on your experience and interpretation of the debates about race and racism in your community or country? So I've just popped that question in the chat. Kenan, back to you. I mean, like you proposed, like you just potted it, you know, you just summarized that so eloquently, that race is that modern concept of difference. Racism created race rather than the other way around. And I think it is a real kind of turn it on its head moment, but one that feels really rich to dig into. And one of the things I took from that is that, you know, is that an Enlightenment, a secular response to explain inequality before inequality would have been, you know, divinely distributed, as it were, in that kind of more pre-modern way of thinking. And given that this group is a network for religion and belief, is there a role that you can unpack about religion and belief in this story, these two histories?
Yes, there's a lot to unpack there, but ideas of equality and universality are to varying degrees at the heart of many religions, you know, the monotheistic faiths, Buddhism and Confucianism, if you wish to call them religions. But religions are also grounded in specific social circumstances, and those circumstances shape how faith is interpreted. So you take something like Christianity, there are, as you know, many who argue that the roots of Enlightenment universalism, Enlightenment equality, lies in Christian thinking, that equality and universality in the modern world are secularized versions of Christian philosophy. But it's not nearly so simple as that. You know, for 2 millennia, the church accepted that status and hierarchy, inequality and privilege were, in an earthly sense, socially necessary and inevitable. Virtually every Christian thinker until modern times accepted the legitimacy of slavery, treating slavery as a condition of the body and universalism as a condition of the spirit. And so on debates on these issues, Christians were divided, not theologically, but on political lines. And I think that's what I try and bring out, certainly in the early part of the book. So you take something like the Putney debates, which, for those who don't know, took place during the English Civil Wars between the soldiers, between the leaders of the New Model Army, who was the kind of main parliamentarian group in the Civil War between Parliament and Charles. And it was a debate between the leaders of the army and ordinary soldiers, who were represented by groups like the Levellers and other such groups who were radical egalitarians. All were Christian, all were Puritan, but the leaders wanted to restrain equality, democracy, suffrage. The Levellers, and even more so the Diggers, an even more radical group, wanted to expand them. And in a sense, this is part of a wider debate between, in the Reformation, between the magisterial Reformation and those represented by people like Luther and Calvin, and the radical Reformation. They read the same Bible, worshipped the same God, had the same view of what faith entailed, but had radically different views about the meaning of equality and universality, because those views are shaped by class and politics, not by theology. Different political views led them to interpret the Bible very differently. And that's true, I think, of every religion. If you look at Islam today, that's exactly the same in Islam today, and in every other religion. So it's that kind of complex relationship between politics and religion often becomes a means to justify a particular political line. But nevertheless, what matters is actually the political divides to which religion often, or a particular form of religion often gives a justification to.
Yeah, and I think that the role of politics in different systems of belief, including beliefs or concepts of race and racism as well, is something that really kind of comes through. And I think one of the things I took from that part of the book was there's a danger in defending race and racial concepts, and upholding those existing hierarchies. And I think there's quite a lot of nostalgia, particularly in both the left and the right, in terms of fixed identities, what it is to be white, what it is to be black, and that these things are fixed, I think. I'm not sure I expressed that particularly well, but it feels more problematic for the left, I think, because I think the right tend to be more comfortable with status quo and that kind of rigid definitions of difference.
I think you're right there, and there's been a shift as well on the left as to what we mean by racism, anti-racism, equality, universality, and so on. Those kinds of issues. There's been quite a major shift, and in part the book attempts to address that, because I'm fairly old-fashioned in the way I look at these things. I'm part of the left, the old left, if you like, in those terms. I mean, one of the key arguments in the book is that ideas of race are a means of marginalizing the political, that politics is a way of trying to ensure that rights and duties and obligations flow not from one's being, the essence of one's being, from nature or identity, but from one's beliefs and actions as citizens. And the racial view takes the opposite stance, that rights and duties and obligations are rooted in nature or culture or history. And to a degree, what I call identitarian politics also views people in terms of where they come from or what is their essential being, rather than membership of a public arena. But there's a kind of second aspect to this, which is that, and then we have a lot of debate around identity politics, but I think what is often missed, I think, is that the roots of identity politics lie in a sense of social pessimism.
Yeah.
That, what I call radical universalism, which is what I champion in the book, is rooted in the belief in social change, and belief that it is possible to overcome the fissures of race and identity, to build movements of solidarity that can transform radically society. But that belief has ebbed to a large extent over the past half century. The disintegration of wider social movements and radical struggles, the weakening of labor movement organizations, the disintegration of the left, and so on. And it's left many people clinging more fiercely to their identities as a kind of place of safety, and as a place where they can find solace and
community.
Indeed, yeah. And so, as hopes for social change have eroded, in a way, many people have been forced to hunker down in their separate boxes. And the more one hunkers down, the more that those boxes become the only way through which to perceive the world, and the more that one's race and identity looms ever larger in one's consciousness, if you like. And in that sense, you talk about essentialism. Essentialism is in that sense, it's a denial of the possibilities of change and the possibilities of political, social transformation.
Yeah, the pessimism part of it, like if it can't be changed, then this is the way it is, and if this is the way it is, this is my community. This is where I take support from. And I think, it does kind of cut off a lot of possibilities by thinking in that way, and without building those broader bridges. There's one part where you're talking about newly post-revolutionary France, when Jewish French people had to take a particular oath, and that was much debated. But it's that kind of, you have to set aside somehow your religious or your cultural identity in order to enter that broader politic. And there's different tests that kind of come up again and again. I mean, back in the 1980s in the UK, I think it was which cricket team you were supporting in your time off, if you were into cricket. And today it seems to be, we uphold these sort of so-called values of tolerance in Britain, but actually there's, at the same time as saying that, it's undercut with this deep intolerance and these huge contradictions. I'm just thinking about the last weekend where we've just had the coronation of King Charles III, and this so-called optional oath of allegiance that everyone had to or could have chosen to partake of. I mean, it just felt very medieval. What do you think? What conditions do we place on inclusion at the moment while we've got this identity mindset?
I think in a way this goes back to the point I was making before about the racial or identitarian viewpoint marginalizing the political. I mean, you said, I can't remember exactly what you said, but it's something like you have to put aside your religious belief. And I wouldn't look at it like that. It's not so much you have to put aside your religious beliefs, but religious belief does not become the metric of one's place in public life. I mean, that's I think that's a slightly different way of putting it, because for example, when it came to Jewish emancipation, it was a big debate in 19th century Europe. There still is a debate in many ways of whether treating Jews as citizens required them to give up Judaism. That was a major debate, and that the Jews had to be emancipated from Judaism itself. Of course, so that's it's important not to see equality as requiring one to give up one's attachment to religion or one's faith. But the point you're making about the oath of allegiance, about citizenship, it's in a sense it's kind of broader issue here, because it's an issue about how we look at the question of solidarity or social affiliation, how we affiliate to each other. And I think there are kind of two broad ways one can look at this. One is to say that we share a common identity, whether that be race or gender or sexuality or nation. And the other is to say that commonality emerges not from particular identities, but from a shared set of values and beliefs, and the struggles to win acceptance for those values and beliefs. And the distinction, of course, it's not clear-cut. There's elements of both coexist in many forms of collective politics. But one of the shifts, I think, that have taken place over the last 30, 40 years is that solidarity as emerging from a shared set of values and beliefs has crumbled, largely because those more radical movements, those social movements in which those ideas were embodied, have their influences eroded. And for many today, the only form of collective politics that seems possible is that rooted in identity, and that the frameworks through which we kind of make sense of the world are often less liberal or conservative or socialist, and often white or Muslim or English or European, that these become the frameworks through which we kind of understand who we are, what our values are, what our values should be, who we affiliate and show solidarity to, and so on. And I see that as a problem.
No, yeah, and I think I would probably share your view of that as problematic. And I think that the chapter where you kind of look at the resistance to racism and colonialism was just, I found that amazing, really uplifting, but also kind of nostalgic. Like where are those movements? Where are those bonds of solidarity? Where you have the Chartists talking about the 1857 Indian Mutiny and the Haitian Revolution, the latter of which I know very little about that at all, but you say very strongly it takes that Declaration of the Rights of Man through to its full conclusion in a way that just France nor America did. And it feels like a huge amount is overlooked in the way that we're taught history and the histories that we learn. I guess why did you choose, which elements of history did you bring into that? And What else have we lost
Yeah,
by not seeing them?
Yeah, I mean, the Haitian Revolution to me is crucially important. It's one of the three major revolutions of the 18th century, but one which, you know, when we compare it to the place that the American and French revolutions have in our culture, it's barely remembered. It's kind of marginalized, and yet it's through the Haitian Revolution in which the slaves of the French colony of Saint-Domingue emancipated themselves. And declared an independent nation, Haiti, and that the emancipatory logic of universalism was pushed much further than Enlightenment philosophers wanted it to be, or most Enlightenment philosophers wanted to be. There's been a fierce debate in recent decades about the Enlightenment, a debate in which both supporters and critics present it as a peculiarly European phenomenon. For one, it's a demonstration of the greatness of Europe. The other, a reminder that its ideals are tainted by racism and colonialism. And I know I'm being a bit crudely characterizing it, but that's broadly kind of sense of the debate. And I think what both misses the importance of the non-European world in shaping many of the ideas we now associate with the Enlightenment, that it's through the struggles of those denied equality and liberty by the elites in Europe and America, that ideas of universalism were invested with meaning. And that to me is the importance of the Haitian Revolution, because it was a revolution that revealed both the necessity for and the shortcomings of the Enlightenment, that French revolutionaries who overthrew the old regime in 1789 had done so in the name of the rights of man, but they specifically excluded those rights from applying to the colonies. Slavery was maintained, as was colonialism, and it was the insurrection by Haitian slaves that transformed the meaning of slavery, of universal rights, that forced the French to abolish slavery, first on Saint-Domingue and then in all French territories, though it was later restored. But in a sense, the slaves had compelled French revolutionaries to take seriously their own revolutionary ideals. And I think that's what's often missing in the debate about universalism or the Enlightenment. The degree to which those who would deny those rights, in a sense, gave those rights meaning. It's in their struggles through which those rights were given meaning. And what I wanted to show in the book was the importance of abolitionism, of anti-colonialism, of anti-racism in maintaining a radical sensibility of what I call the radical universalist tradition. Because again, the Enlightenment, we kind of talk about the Enlightenment, but it was not a singular blob with a single set of views and ideals. It was cut through with conflicts and contradictions. And one of the most important was that between the mainstream and the radical Enlightenment. The mainstream Enlightenment, the figures with which we're most familiar and about which historians have most written, Locke and Hume and Jefferson and Kant and Voltaire and so on. They combined a defense of liberty and equality with a racial view of the world, an acceptance, often celebration of colonialism, with racist attitudes, and some even an acceptance of slavery. And liberty and equality only applied to a select few. And the radicals, who are lesser known figures like Diderot or D'Holbach or Spinoza, were hostile to racism and slavery and colonialism. There's a quote from Diderot I always like, which is which he asks about colonialists. Do you see here civilized people arriving among savages, or do you see savages received by civilized people? Which kind of expresses his view about colonialism. And that struggle between the mainstream and the radicals was key in shaping the character of the Enlightenment and of framing subsequent debates about race and colonialism. I mean, you mentioned the Chartists and the the Indian Mutiny, and the debate over the Indian Mutiny, which was in fact an early nationalist insurrection in India. The debate between the liberals and the radicals is quite kind of brings out the differences very well, because someone like John Stuart Mill, who's the kind of the lodestone of Victorian liberalism, he was also a supporter of colonialism. He worked for the East India Company, which at that time governed India. And then after the mutiny, he wrote a long memorandum to Parliament defending British rule by listing all the advantages, he thought that British rule had brought to India. But working class radicals, especially which grew out of the Chartist movement, for those who don't know, which was the kind of working class movement for suffrage, which developed in the 1840s. By 1857, the movement had largely disappeared, but its spirit lived on in various organizations and newspapers, including one called the People's Paper, which was the main Chartist paper. And they argued that the struggle in India was no different to struggles for freedom by European peoples. Britons had supported Poles in their conflict with Russia, or they support Hungarians in their conflict with Austria, and they should equally support the struggle of Indians against the British. And what we have here is that, on the one hand, the liberals, the so-called backwardness of non-Europeans, validated colonialism. For radicals, liberty and equality were the prerogative of all, not the privilege of a civilized few. And a century and a half later, we're still having those same debates. There's a whole host of new writers and books defending colonialism on the ground that it brought advancement to non-European people. So 150 years on, that debate between liberals and radicals still continues.
It's an interesting one, and I tend to think in terms of left and right overly simplistically, and I don't know how helpful that is when approaching this subject. But when you talk about, there isn't much shape to radical universalism at the moment as a movement, for example. There is this sense of pessimism. When do you think that, you say over the last 40 years, when and why do you think that shifted? And is it useful to think in terms of left and right? Or are they outdated terms now? The radical universalism might be closer to what I'm looking for than left.
Yeah. I mean, I'm old-fashioned enough still to believe in left and right and
I like that.
as important political categories. And though, part of the problem is what many mean by left has changed around issues such as universalism, such as those kinds of issues, and that the kinds of issues that once drove both the left and anti-racist, anti-colonial movements have become much more questioned these days, and some for quite rightly, but in that questioning, a lot of what's important in those claims have been lost. And you ask, when did it begin to change? And it goes back again. I think we were talking about about social pessimism and the way that the movements of radical social movements, labor movement organizations, trade unions, and so on, how the place they occupied in both society and in public imagination has shifted, that the influence is much less than it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. And it seems to me it's in that shift that a lot of these changes take place. So, for example, if you talk about identitarian movements, there have always been identitarian strands within anti-racist, anti-colonial movements. the Back to Africa movements of the 19th century, Garveyism, Pan-Africanism, negritude, and so on. And these strands developed in response to that gap between an abstract belief in equality expressed by many in Western societies and the reality of a world built on race and colonialism. And what it did was lead many to question the very worth of those ideas, of European ideas, of those abstract ideas, because many asked, if Europe was responsible for the subjugation of more than half the world, what worth could there be in its moral and political ideals, which at best had failed to prevent that subjugation, at worst had provided its intellectual grounding? And so many argue that non-Europeans had to develop their own ideals and beliefs and values rooted in their own cultures and histories. And it's the argument that laid the ground for those challenging injustice and oppression to cleave to what we now call the politics of identity. But in the past, these movements were relatively marginal, and there were moments when they caught flame, Garveyism, Pan-Africanism, and so on. But those were singular moments, I think. And many embodied deeply reactionary ideas. Garvey's views about mixed race, for instance, Senghor's views about the same, and about the difference in black and white ways of thinking, and so on. But it wasn't until the post-war years that they became dominant, that those kinds of, over the last 30, 40 years. And there are many reasons for this. But most important is the issue we keep coming back to, which is the rise of social pessimism, the belief that many people no longer have, that it's possible to overcome the cleavages of race and identity to build those broader movements of solidarity. So if you take something like critical race theory, for instance, which is there's been all manner of criticism, some valuable, others quite execrable. But what all miss out, I think, is that something like critical race theory is a product of the demise of radical social movements and the rise of social pessimism. So we can see that in a figure like Derek Bell. It's not someone that most people know about, but he's been hugely influential as perhaps the most significant founder of critical race theory. He was a key figure in the civil rights movement. He was a lawyer who helped desegregate schools in the South, but who became disillusioned by lack of progress in overcoming racism. He came to see racism as permanent and unmovable. He believed that Black people would never gain full equality. And not to accept that fact would do great mental and emotional harm. And a few who've been inspired by Bell's work, and many have, from people like from Barack Obama to Michelle Alexander, but few have I suppose fallen into that kind of sense of existential despair as Bell did. But pessimism nevertheless shapes much of our contemporary thinking about race and anti-racism. So someone like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's perhaps the most influential of contemporary African-American essayists, he likens racism to a natural disaster like an earthquake or a typhoon. And he says, just as earthquakes or typhoons cannot be stopped by laws or by social movements, neither can racism. And inevitably, challenging racism while believing it to be ineradicable has inevitably shaped the character of anti-racism. It's been a shift, I think, from campaigns for material change and demand for symbolic gestures and representational fairness, and that's something that I deeply worry about.
No, the symbolic gestures and representation, I think, is really interesting. Again, with a UK frame on this, there's been quite a lot of debate again about the coronation. Our Prime Minister, who is Hindu, Rishi Sunak, read from the Bible, and that's gone down in a particular way on GB News. You know, why have we got somebody Hindu reading the Bible at the coronation? It's like, he's the Prime Minister. But again, it's this, you know, here's a symbolic gesture for diversity or inclusion, but at the same time, it never quite seems to tick the boxes from the establishment's point of view either. It's a no-win situation, it seems.
But there's the other way of looking at it too, and I agree that there's been some appalling racist responses to it. But there's the other way of looking at it too, which is that in many ways that we've reframed equality as diversity. So diversity has become what when we want equality, we talk now about diversity. But it's quite possible to have a diverse society which is deeply unequal. It's a kind of society we have now.
We've got it. Yeah.
Oh, exactly. You know, and I think it was someone put it, an elite that is diverse is nevertheless still the elite. And I think part of the problem is that shift from equality to diversity. Diversities are good, don't get me wrong. I think it's important, but when it becomes the end point, it becomes problematic to me.
No, it's interesting.
Sorry, just go back. Go back to this point about Rishi Sunak and I mean, this again in Britain, there's been a major debate because so many leading conservative politicians, members of the government, are of a minority background. Prime Minister, until recently, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Home Secretaries for the last 3 or 4
Foreign Secretary,
and so on. And so there's been a big debate about how Britain's become more diverse. But you know, these are politicians who are shaped not by their skin color or by ethnicity or by their culture. They're shaped by their class and their ideology. You know, what links them all is not simply their skin color, but the fact that they all went to private school, that they all come from a particular background. And we often forget that we think diversity simply in terms of race and ethnicity and culture, never in terms of class, for instance. And that, to me, again, is part of the problem. That what links them is not their ethnicity or culture. What makes Rishi Sunak the Prime Minister he is, what makes Suella Braverman, who's the Home Secretary, impose some of the most abysmal immigration and asylum policies. It's got nothing to do with her culture or her background or her ethnicity. It's entirely to do with her class and ideology.
Absolutely. And I think that recognition of class, I thought, was really interesting. Just in terms of those, again, going back to those solidarities. I mean, where do you see I'm going to open this up to everyone else, probably after this question, actually, just to let everyone get your questions ready. But where do you see the role for radical universalism nowadays, and where are the seeds for that? Where are the signs for optimism, I guess, in terms of those broader solidarities?
Well, there are always movements to and organizations pushing back against many of the retrogressive ways in which the world is organized. It's in a way it seems to me that it's precisely because the world is so fragmented and polarized that a radical universalist perspective becomes so necessary. So struggles against over issues such as immigration and asylum laws seem to be crucial in this. There are means, because such laws are ways not just to divide us, and to make us think in terms of us and them. But also a means of deflecting the real reasons we have, poor housing or low wages or creaking health services, and migrants have become the scapegoat. So it seems to me that those pushing back against Fortress Europe or Fortress Britain, Fortress America, they're doing the kinds of work that is necessary now to reclaim a more radical universalist tradition that, that in many ways they're the equivalent today of those fighting against abolition, those fighting for abolition or civil rights unionism in the past.
That's great to hear. I'm actually working for a charity that works in the UK with migrant women, specifically caught in the immigration and criminal justice system. Of course, immigration has become effectively criminalised in the last 2 years. I'm really keen to hear questions and views from people in the audience. If you want to put hands up or post in the chat as well. And also, I'm just aware that both Kenan and myself are from the UK, and a number of you are not. So it'd be also really interesting to hear any reflections in terms of how this debate is framed or experienced in your own country. And while everyone else is thinking of their question, I know Lorenzo has one. So I'm going to put you on the spot.
I mean, we have like a big contribution from Mira, that she's been writing some interesting some interventions in the chat. I don't know, it's probably easier if Kenan, if he wants to read them directly.
Okay.
Or Mira, do you want to speak to them now? It'd be great, actually, about...
Sorry. Do you want to bring the chat up?
Yeah, thank you. I can maybe just speak to what I wanted to say. I feel like a lot of times when people are trying to define identity politics, and it's become like diversive even to talk about it in some spaces. And for me, it's astonishing how little thought is given to, or even kind of research has gone into looking into the roots of where the concept of identity politics comes from. And it, like I say, it comes from the Combahee River Collective, but the this understanding of how people are impacted by more than one system of oppression because of how they're perceived by others is based on people's lived experiences. So these are not just theoretical frameworks. And I know when then that kind of transformed in the legal sense into the concept or framework of intersectionality. But for me, the pushback that I seem to hear from most people, and in doing this conversation too, is not a critique of identity politics if you understand it from its roots and what it meant to help us understand, and how it's meant to help us analyze our own context and existence within the histories of from where we are and the context we are in. But it's a critique of representation politics. And that's exactly my critique of actually the book Elite Capture, because the framing of how, it's sad to me, how identity politics is now framed is from the definition that's been given by most of right-wing political kind of groupings, and how it's seen as a pejorative now. By most people, even the left has internalized that definition and understanding of identity politics, where it's seen as something that is divisive, that doesn't help us build solidarity, when in fact identity politics does the exact opposite. It's supposed to bring us all together to understand different perspectives, understand how, even though we may not have the same identities, how some of our issues help us find common ground and work together. So for me, it's really strange when people say identity politics does not help us find solidarity and meaning within movements and help us reach out across borders. I know So for me, that's a critique of representation politics, which is linked to what now has become the DEI industry, diversity, equity, inclusion, where it's just about, you know, the symbolism of it and tokenizing people of marginalized identities. And for me, I think what helps build solidarity is when people come to understand that it's important for us to let us define people as they are, of who they are, instead of putting labels on people. And for me, identity politics does exactly that. It helps me define who I am rather than how I'm perceived by others, because usually this us against them dynamics comes into play when other people are defining us and how they're perceiving us. So building internationalism takes more than just having one umbrella movement under which we all can gather. For me, it's fine if it's decentralized, localized, and there are multiple disparate movements everywhere, and we find connection somehow. And I think that's the nature of how society is now, where everything's digital, everything's, you know, on social media, and how people are connecting is different. So there are local groupings of people that come together. So I think it's a disservice when we say there are no big movements that we're seeing that are working towards social change. I think there are a lot of micro movements that may or may not come together, but many people are working within their local context, building, you know, during COVID, I am a part of the disability community, and there was a lot of mutual aid kind of micro groupings that we were coming together, and care networks that we formed. And that's because of the kind of governments we have, and this whole kind of swing towards the right across Europe and the US, that people don't trust their governments anymore. So they come together in smaller groups and in kind of more localized groups, whether that's online or in person. COVID has changed things a lot of how people gather, but there's lots of work that's going on to understand how is it that people gather, why do they gather differently, how do they mobilize around different issues. And I feel like now it's very local context based, but some of the issues maybe we'll find linkages. There are some issues which are global that have different manifestations locally, but I think it's okay if movements are decentralized and not connected in big ways under one big umbrella term that could be termed as a mass movement. I think it's a disservice when we ignore the little micro kind of activism that's going on everywhere.
No, I think well, I'll let Kenan answer, but it's interesting what you're saying. I might come back to a couple of things. Kenan, I don't know if you want to
sure
comment on that.
I'm not arguing that there is no there are no movements for change, or no struggles. What I'm arguing is that the way the social movement, the radical social movements that brought people together, the kinds of labor movement organizations that brought people together, they've all largely fragmented. And I think it's been quite clear over the last 30, 40 years. Going back to the thing about identity politics, I think the first thing is that I think one thing points I was trying to make was that identity politics or movements based on identity-based movements have always existed within anti-racist, anti-colonial movements going back to the 19th century. So it's, I mean, I know Columbia River Collective gave us the phrase identity politics, but the politics of identity existed long before that. And there's always been a tension between those movements that have that are based on rooted in one's identity, and broader, more universalist-based movements. So that's always been there. What's new is not that identity movements have suddenly appeared. It is that they've become much more the dominant feature of anti-colonial, anti-racist movements. I think to understand that, there's kind of a number of threads to pull out. One is that we need to distinguish between identity and the politics of identity. I mean, identity sort of great significance to all of us. They give each of us a sense of ourselves, of our grounding in the world, of our relationships to other people. But politics is also, or should be, a means of taking us beyond the constricted sense of identity given to each of us by the specific circumstances and the particularities of our personal experiences. And one of the stories, for instance, I tell in the book is about the sanitation workers' strike in New Orleans in 2020, which kind of shows, or certainly to me, some of the problems with thinking in terms of racial or ethnic or other such identities, because it's in the context of the debate around Black Lives Matter and the whole movement around Black Lives Matter. One of the arguments around Black Lives Matter, I mean, there's an argument about, is it divisive, or is it a kind of reawakening of anti-racist consciousness and of Black self-expression? And it seems to me that it's neither. It is the movement and the debate around it gives voice to that tension between an essentialist and a universalist perspective. So to see you know, the Black Lives Matter, it's the idea that we see ourselves as part of a global Black family, which is one of its arguments. The trouble is, a global Black family is a confected unity, which only serves to obscure divisions within Black communities. So going back to this point about the New Orleans sanitation workers' strike, it broke out in May 2020. A strike of Black workers who walked out because of poverty, wages, because of lack of safety equipment, the refusal to recognize unions. Virtually all the workers were Black, but so were the employers, because New Orleans had outsourced sanitation work to a Black-owned company as part of its anti-racist drive. And Black Lives Matter meant something very different to the two sides of that picket line, to the two sides of that divide. The workers came out on strike 3 weeks before George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis. The murder that energized a global movement and behind the banner of Black Lives Matter. And they remained on strike throughout that summer, which was, you know, the summer of Black Lives Matter. And yet they were forced back to work by September, having won virtually none of their demands. The Black employees won, the Black workers lost. And it's a reminder, I suppose, that to assume that there exists a common set of interests or an identity that binds together Black people is to reinforce the power of the Black elites, to diminish the voices of Black workers, is to conflate the necessity of challenging racism with the building of racial solidarity. And that, to me, seems to me the problem with how with what I see as a problem with what we now call identity politics, but and what is a problem that's always been there from the 19th century onwards. It is just that the other side of that debate, the universalist side of the debate, which used to be dominant, has now virtually disappeared. That seems to me the problem.
It's interesting, and Mira, you've just popped in the chat. People hold multiple identities, which they do, and I'm interested actually whether some of this is about the decline of class as an identity to some extent, or what it is to be working class or middle class, because that's become more, what's the word, grey, I guess. It's all a bit precarious. Unless you
sorry, are you asking me?
No, I'm just throwing it out there.
I'll just say on that, by the way, that reducing class to identity is part of the problem. Class has become an identity in that sense.
No, that's a good point. That makes sense. Lorenzo, did you want to come in?
Yes, actually, I had one question, like about the first part of the book, like going back to the concept of like the birth of race, basically. There's this bit that I found like quite enlightening when you say it is not racial differences that have led to unequal treatment, but the persistence of social inequalities in societies with a commitment to equity, to equality, that has led many to view such inequalities as ineradicable and hence natural. So my question is, I mean, according to this thought, like, is a bit, how do you see like future perspectives? So if you think that the only way to eradicate racism and the concept of race from our society is by eliminating social inequalities and basically turn the process the other way around, in other words, like, how do you see like equality speeches and anti-racism speeches and education compared to structural social inequalities? Like, if you think that the only way is to eradicate social inequalities.
Well, I suppose what I'm arguing against is the idea that it's become quite common among certain kind of liberal circles that the way to eliminate racism is to stop thinking about race. And to me that cannot work, because it's not us thinking about race that's the problem. It is the reality of inequalities, including racial inequalities, that's the problem. And that in order to challenge racial inequalities, we cannot rid ourselves of racial inequalities simply by ridding ourselves of racial inequalities in and of themselves. I don't think any of us here would accept that. So it's just a way of saying that the challenge to racism and to racial inequalities has to be part of a much larger movement against those kinds of inequalities, against a system that requires those inequalities, that uses those inequalities to create divisions within solidarity movements.
Thank you.
I don't know if that answered what you were getting at.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, it was just to see, yeah, how do you see the process in the future? If like how it's born is like the only way to eradicate it is like to go back on how it's born. So by social inequalities. So if that is what we have to change first.
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem, I think, is because we think so much in terms of race and ethnicity, that a lot of divisions that are not actually that appear to be divisions of race and ethnicity aren't really divisions of race and ethnicity. To give I'll give both a UK and an American example. UK example, many of the ethnic divisions that we see in education or in employment, for instance, between the way that people of Indian background, of heritage, do much better than those of Pakistani or Bangladeshi heritage, or those of Black African heritage do much better than those of Caribbean heritage. Those actually in many ways reflect class divisions as much as they express ethnic divisions. The difference between, say, those of Indian origins and those of Pakistani, Bangladeshi origins is not just an ethnic one, but a class distinction too. Similarly, until recently, the distinction between those of Black African origin, those of Black Caribbean origin, was also as much to do with class as it was to do with ethnicity. We often forget that, and therefore we look at we look at racial categories when they're not the most useful way of thinking about it. Or to take something that's a lot more controversial, something like mass incarceration in the USA, and the argument that this is the new Jim Crow. In fact, a lot of, and it's true that if you look at incarceration and the rise in incarceration rates since the 70s, African Americans have borne the brunt of it, without any question. But it's also the case that if you look at different income levels and look at incarceration rates at different income levels, there's actually little difference between the incarceration rates of blacks and whites. The difference is across income levels, as you would expect, that those of low income are vastly more incarcerated than those of higher income. And so the issue here is that African Americans are, because of racism, are disproportionately poor and working class, and therefore disproportionately incarcerated. But at the same time, the issue here we're talking about is the policing of poor communities, both black and white, because if you are white school leaver in America, you're about 15 times as likely to be incarcerated as if you're a black university graduate. So what I'm saying is that there's a kind of complexity to this that we often forget because we try to we look at the world too much through purely racial or ethnic lenses, and we forget that there's a kind of we can call it intersectionality if you like, but there's a kind of complexity to the way social inequality works, which we often forget about.
I just want to come back with a question. We will be wrapping up in about 10 minutes if people want to ask anything else. But actually that, again, just keeps coming back again and again, how persistent the concept of race is, even though there's no scientific basis for it. Why do you think that is? Why do you think we hold on to that?
Well, race is a way of accepting or justifying inequalities in a world that formally believes in equality by imagining that certain people are by nature incapable or unworthy of equality or liberty. And the interesting thing about this is that we think of race entirely these days in terms of skin color or continent of origin, black, white, Asian, and so on. But if you go back to the 19th century, that wasn't how it was perceived. Race was as much a question of social status and social difference as it was of skin color. So the working class was seen, quite literally, it's difficult to comprehend it now, but quite literally as racially distinct, that the working class was as racially distinct from the middle class as many now see blacks and whites as racially distinct. That only changed at the beginning of the 20th century. And of course, as we know, who is white and what groups whiteness encompasses has also shifted hugely over the past century and a half. So race is a way of kind of making sense of a world, if you like, which at an abstract level accepts equality, but in reality is deeply unequal, and treats certain groups as if they are unworthy of equality. Race becomes a way of justifying that.
It's an interesting one. INORB this week are holding an event with a number of Albanian organisations to discuss the rise of anti-Albanian racism specifically, which I think illustrates that point as well. And as Mira's popped in the chat too, it's not just about skin colour, it's that marginalisation element.
Indeed, I mean it's interesting that in the context of the Ukrainian war, for instance, that how until relatively recently Slavs were seen as racially inferior and racially distinct from whites. Again, there's a kind of historical amnesia about this, and we forget that kind of history of race because we live in a world where Slavs no longer are seen in that way. But it is extraordinary how deep that kind of racism towards Slav runs in European cultures and ran until relatively recently.
Yeah, I was thinking again what you were saying about the working class in the 19th century. There were a number of classifications, weren't there, of skull types and criminology, and this is the lowest of the low kind of classification on that basis, and it was very much fixed. Thank you.